Deborah Halverson edited children's books for 10 years before becoming a writer herself. Since then, she has written 2 young adult novels, a picture book, and 3 books for struggling readers. She is also the founder of DearEditor.com, an advice website for writers. Donning her editorial hat once again, Deborah has also written Writing Young Adult Fiction for Dummies and her newest book, Writing New Adult Fiction. Today, Deborah is going to talk to us about new adult fiction and how writers can make the most of this new opportunity. Hi, Deborah. I'm very excited to be talking to you today and learning all about this great new writing opportunity called new adult fiction. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I love to talk about it.
Great. So let's start by first, can you give me a definition of what exactly are new adults?
I can. New adults are the 18 to 25-year-olds who are shedding their roles in the relationships that they have grown up with, that were assigned to them by perhaps their parents or their circumstances or the social circles of their particular schools. And they're moving out in the world beyond their parental oversight or whatever their authority figure is. And they're now forming their own social circles. And all the freedom that they've yearned for to find out who they are and to be who they are, they finally have it. And it's kind of a now what moment as they go about living this self-actualized life and setting up those new social circles and experimenting and exploring. The age is very much defined by identity establishment. And it can reach up as high as our first career forays, because at that point they're still planning, they're doing still life assessment planning, seeing if the plans they were laying are what they want, still some experimenting before they settle into adulthood, which is about settling into that career and maybe that spouse and establishing the family, taking on other responsibilities instead of just yourself anymore.
Okay, so when you are looking at books for new adults versus traditional young adult fiction, what are some of the big differences in the books and the stories?
I think it's easy to point to the age of the characters, and many will point to maybe the explicitness of the sexual content as being 2 distinguishing factors in the stories you get from in new adult fiction as opposed to young adult fiction. But really, NA has a distinct mindset. These young people have now an unfettered self-responsibility. It's not other people putting the restrictions on them. So the stories are about them being empowered and doing. And they show the perspective of new adults reflected in the activities that they're doing in the stories, in the adventures that they're having, in the whole new adult experience. Young adult stories have at their heart that yearning to break free and be on their own and feel empowered. And NA really is that now what phase. It's their grandiose expectations are now meeting with reality. And so the stories are very much about dealing with what happens in that clash of expectations and reality. New adult stories tend to have a lot of the same optimism about themselves and their own futures that we might find in the young adult fiction. Even if they have kind of a grim outlook about the world as a whole, they feel like their futures, they've done studies with new adults where most of them say they feel very good about their futures and what will happen even if they're pessimistic about what's going on around them. And so these stories are really saturated with the feeling of I can do it, the positive energy. So even as they're knocked down by the obstacles you throw in their path, they can pick themselves up and go forward. A lot of these stories will deal with maybe the traumas that in their young adulthood was very much about surviving it. And now they're coming to a phase in their life where they're finding out survival isn't enough. It's about either accepting it or coping with how it's changed your life and moving on. So it's kind of a next step feeling. And this can happen whether it's contemporary realistic fiction or it's a paranormal with demons or historical fiction. We all hit that point in our life where we're on our own for our first time, and what does that mean? There's a lot of change in that. And change, even if it's good, is stressful. So these stories are very informed by a sensibility that there's a lot of stress going on. Whether it's exciting, whether it's experimenting, exploring is good, it's stressful, and that affects all the decisions the characters make and how they respond emotionally. So there's a lot of fun fiction opportunities in that, regardless of what genre you've chosen to set these people in. Whether it's science fiction, they're still having that moment in their lives. And while our young adults we have young people who think deeply about life, and they are starting to move beyond how everything is very self-centered and how does it impact them first. And they're thinking deeply about the world. But those teens don't really have the experience or wisdom or perspective yet that they're gaining in those new adult years as they're out living it. And so there's a little more wisdom influencing or what they're doing, and just wisdom attainment in these stories.
So it sounds to me like sort of a stepping stone between the young adult and the new adult is young adult is often considered sort of coming of age books, or these characters are thinking, can I do this? And new adult, they are thinking they've come of age, they've sort of crossed that threshold, and they're saying, how am I going to do this? Or, yes, I can do this, now let's put it into action. So is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, some people will even call it the quarter life crisis. Now I'm out here, what do I do? Now that I've gotten what I want. And so I think that's a fair assessment of what's going through these minds as the characters deal with it, and as the sensibility of the stories. I think that's a great way to define it.
Mm-hmm. Would a young adult book a new adult book ever take place in high school? Or is it specifically college and above, or working characters who are in a job? Is there ever a high school setting in a new adult book?
Not usually. Generally, it's when they've moved out of high school. It's a kind of a post-graduation experience. That doesn't mean it's about college. Just 40% of American kids don't go from being handed their high school diploma to going straight to college. They do other things. But it's generally understood that once they've left that structured life and environment where they have imposed structure from the outside, generally of school, but parenthood. And that actually causes a bit of fuzzy ground for some people trying to understand it, as they say, well, in those fantasy books, they're not in a high school. They're off having their quest and all. So what's the difference between the young adult and new adult then? They're still 17, 18. And we can put more graphic material in that, maybe. They might call that the mature YA. And I think that the defining line is not so much whether they're in the school or not. It's rather what point on their journey are they on now? Are they still in that young adult perspective where it's more how do things affect me first and foremost, and just learning to look outward through the course of that story? Or are they already one step beyond that? Just throwing in more explicit romance does not pop it out of young adult into new adult. So there's kind of, some people describe that as a mature YA kind of realm.
So if I'm a young adult writer, and I've been writing, young adult books, do I have to change my style at all when writing for new adults?
I think it's about more than changing words. I mean, some people would think I can use bigger words now because or the characters can speak with a larger vocabulary, and it's not a matter of just being handed a high school diploma and suddenly you're speaking with bigger words. It's very much about tapping into those things that I talked about how they think, and so your style wouldn't necessarily change the way you put sentences together or flow on the page. Rather, what you choose to focus on with the story, if it's a third-person narrative or a first-person, what they choose to talk about and focus on that would reflect where they are in their path. For instance, you might have a young adult character might say something like, I hate school, it's very much about me first, whereas maybe an older new adult character might say school is hard. There's a bit of a step outward and seeing that outside thing first. Depending on how young your characters are in the new adult spectrum, they might show more of that self-centeredness, not selfishness, but self-centeredness. They may fall back on that when they're stressed out. They may say, the commander needs this done, this job done, so I better get it done. When they're really stressed out, they might say, oh, I got to get this done or I'm screwed. They might slip back more into that. So that might be, it's just how you choose to talk about the experiences. You'd show the process of perhaps considering the choices that are ahead of you, really weighing them, but ultimately a new adult still might give in to the temptation of, do I go to bed early so I can get up and impress my boss at my new job tomorrow morning? I know I should, but there's my roommate fixing up her hair and putting on her makeup and talking about how I'm just going to go. I'll work it out in the morning. And then they deal with the problems of working out in the morning. That sort of thing. They might weigh the consequences more. I think that's really where the change would come, in the sensibility of what you're choosing to talk about, as opposed to how you string the sentences together. That's why I think that a lot of people who write new adult also write young adult. Jennifer Armentrout, who is a very successful new adult author, also writes young adult, and she adjusts the sensibility of it. She doesn't necessarily change the words that the characters would use, but what they choose to talk about. So she's a great example of where you can see that happening.
And it really is an interesting sort of gray area as teens move from being that sort of more I-centered personality out to the world-centered personality. And if you have kids who are in those upper teen years, you see them starting to move through those steps. And I imagine it's very helpful to spend some time with young adults who are 18, 19, 20 years old and kind of see that transition in their thinking. It's not a hard and fast line that they suddenly cross. There's a lot of going back and forth as they're starting to mature.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's for a long time why many people saw this just as a transition phase from being a young person to an adult person. And in fact, psychologists in the last 10 years have fought and established that this is a developmental phase of life of its own, and they've come up with these characteristics that really define it and have defined why it's different in its own moment, how it's not settled yet, but it's that one time we kind of give these young people permission to be focused on themselves and to do all the exploring they need to do. So what oats need sowing, we give them that moment because it's like we understand it's the one time they can really be just in and about themselves. And so it's really become recognized as its own developmental time. So it seems right that it would get a fiction that's all about that experience now. And you don't need the bookstores to create the shelf space for it anymore. You can go straight from the writer through social media to the audience and make the connection there. And that's how they found there are these people who want to read this time in life.
And I imagine a lot of adults like to read new adult books to remember what that was like, too. Because it is a really amazing time of life where you do have a lot of freedom to explore and sort of figure out who you are, who you're going to be, what the world is. And as we get older, we lose a lot of those freedoms. So it's nice to revisit it through our books, I think, sometimes.
It is. We don't have the luxury of any studies yet, so it's kind of an anecdotal thing. But I interviewed several dozen writers and agents and editors and marketing people for new adult fiction for my new book, and so it's an anecdotal thing, but all of them came back with the same experience. As this writer-reader communion has been going on with social media, they're learning that their readership is, yes, it is the new adults themselves, but that's probably more the second level. The primary readership is these crossover readers that we know from the young adult realm who do exactly what you say. They come back to life when they didn't have all these responsibilities, and they just want to have fun and re-experience that. Maybe it's nostalgia. And so we know in young adult fiction that these can be the I think the primary demographic was 30 to 44 is what they Nielsen found for that crossover readership. And in fact, last year, a study determined that the primary buyers of young adult fiction were age 20 to 29, I believe it was. I wish I pulled out those stats before I sat down, but that right there is the new adult range, you know? And so the people who love YA are either sticking with YA as they grow out of it, or they're moving on to new adult fiction, or they're reading both. And so we do have that crossover readership that's also in the mix as well.
And then if you walk into a bookstore, where are you going to find these books? Are they going to be in the adult fiction section?
It's going to be tough to just walk in and say, I want this kind of book. And you're probably not going to find them in the bookstores in many numbers. It's more of a self-published and an ebook thing. Even publishers like Entangled Embrace are digital first. That is, they publish it as digital editions or ebook that you download and read. And if that sells in enough numbers, then they will print the hardcover books that will go in to the stores, into your Target or whatever, just in like the Summer Reads Roundup or the End Cap or what have you. So it's going to be a little harder to find in the bookstores, but that's because they're not necessarily printing a lot of those books. If you want, it's very much a market that exists on in digital form in various ways. Even when people want the physical book, they're buying it straight from an e-retailer and they're printing the book and sending it. But mostly it's at this point been a matter of ebooks. That's where the primary sales of them seem to be. So it makes it easy to search the categories on your e-retailers, but you can't really walk into bookstores and find, except some of the top books, like Jennifer Armitrout's books might be in there, and Sylvia Day, her books will be in a bookstore. They're probably in the adult fiction section, particularly because their content can be stronger, and so if you were to shelve that in the YA section, there might be a bit of kerfluffle about that.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you, if most of these books are either self-published or digitally published, and it seems to be the case. Are there any particular marketing strategies these authors are using that you're seeing to reach the new adult readers?
Yes, new adult fiction writers are taking advantage of the fantastic new development we have with social media and the internet. You know, back when I started in children's books in 1995, authors were fairly limited on how they could self-promote. You know, they could buy mailing lists and send out postcards or do signings or that sort of thing. So now there are so many more choices that you can do using social media. You can have your blog tours, just having a social media presence, whether you're on Facebook or Twitter. Twitter is incredibly big with new adult authors and readers. There's a lot of sharing that goes on there. People like to say, I read this great book, here's the link. And that's one reason, one of the things I teach people to do is to write a hook statement, you know, that quick little maybe 30, 40-ish statement of what the most standout features of your book are, because people will plug that into their social media and say, there's this great book about blah, blah. And so they're really making use of social media, and there are many, many blogs for reviewing new adult fiction. And so they will host cover reveals for new books, and they will host blog stops. And it's very much the community of readers and bloggers and writers online for new adult fiction is quite big already, just in these few years since it came out. And that's where these authors have a great opportunity that authors did not have in the past. It can become overwhelming, but the opportunities are there when you figure out what it is that is comfortable for you. You can reach people that way. You can have a direct communion with your readers. You can really talk to them. We can't do that with young adult fiction. We're limited on how we can talk directly to young people. So that's a great opportunity.
If I was an author and I really didn't want to go the entirely self-publishing route, are there agents or publishers who are starting to specialize in new adult fiction?
There are. One of them I mentioned just now was Entangled Embrace. About 2012, after we had kind of the big awareness of new adult fiction that summer, a couple of publishers established imprints for new adult fiction, and that's kind of when it gained a validity. It wasn't this flash thing. It was a viable market that could develop into a rich category of literature, just like young adult did, but in a faster way. And so we have Bloomsbury Spark is another one that established an imprint for new adult fiction. But what I like to point writers to when they're looking for who those publishers might be, I mean, the obvious is when it's not self-published is to look and see who's publishing it. But there's a website called NA Alley, New Adult. NAAlley.com, and I think they're revamping things a little bit right now, but they have a section of publishers and agents known to publish and represent new adult fiction. So that's a great starting point. You can even do a simple Google search, new adult fiction and agents, or new adult fiction and publishers, and you will see the times these agents are interviewed on all these blogs, and you can see who those are, because more and more agents are representing it as more publishers are willing to publish it. Some have dedicated imprints, some have established imprints that are young adult and new adult, and some are publishing some of the new adult fiction within their adult programs and some within children. So there's quite a range. So I like to start people at New Adult Alley, NAAlley.com as a great resource. And then there's a Twitter chat called, Pound NA Lit Chat, where every Thursday night writers of new adult fiction get together, and that's a great place to ask too.
Terrific. Well, those are really great tips, and I'm sure this is just the tip of the iceberg on the information that you have in your book. So writing new adult fiction from Writer's Digest Books by Deborah Halverson is something everybody should pick up. This is an exploding market, and I think it's a terrific opportunity for writers, and especially if you are interested in self-publishing or you're really gung-ho about the marketing and the social media. I think this is custom made for you. So, Deborah, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for this opportunity.